Hello and welcome to the GlobalChurch Project. I'm Graham Hill. Daniel Bourdanne was born in Chad. He has served with IFES in Francophone Africa since 1990, including overseeing the whole region, which encompasses 20 French-speaking countries. Daniel Bourdanne is General Secretary of IFES and Deputy Director of the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. Over the past few years, he's led a number of significant training initiatives designed to bring together theologians and local churches in mission and theology. Daniel Bourdanne challenges churches to give their whole lives to Jesus Christ. He challenges us to pursue discipleship and mission, to think about who our life belongs to. He says life is not granted, it belongs to God. As you travel, what's your sense about the greatest challenges facing the church today?
Yeah, that is quite a challenging question. From my personal perspective, I think some of the greatest challenges, from my view, are not external, theological, Islam or things like that. I have the sense that one of the greatest challenges is the church itself. I think the church is like someone who have lost their teeth. So not being able to bite, in my culture you enjoy eating bones. So, and if you don't have teeth in place, you cannot enjoy the bones. So I'm using that image because I think that the church has lost its teeth and is not really prophetic as it should be. So everywhere I travel, my sense is that one of the greatest challenges for the church to restore the confidence in itself, because it has the theology, it has the truth, but the church is no longer standing on the conviction of the uniqueness of Jesus. And for me, this is the greatest challenge. Related to that, the second I can see is the sense of fear. I think maybe the two are connected. I think the church is fearful. It's like somebody who lost the confidence in itself and not being able to articulate their convictions, the truth. And the third thing is losing a significant element of joy. Again, maybe this is reading things from my African background, but visiting the gospel like the Gospel of Luke, I am impressed by the number of times Luke uses the word joy. And it is true. I think the gospel is the gospel of liberation, bringing joy to our lives. And it's a message, it's a good news. And the good news is a good news of joy. And for me, with my African background, looking at the history of Africa that went through different sort of slavery, the Arab slavery, the Western slavery, the colonization. So our history has been always a history of violence in the confrontation with other cultures. And then having a sense of good news, making you free, even if you are not joyful by nature. There is a sense of excitement, and I think the church have to recover the dimension of joy, who is exciting, who can communicate the excitement, the passion, and who can also communicate the hope to the rest of the world. So for me, those are the main things I will see as the challenges. And of course, you can add to that the external challenges like the pluralism. So going on, the world is redesigning itself culturally, and we don't know what will be the future. So it's in process, and so it gives us a sense of insecurity, including theologically, and from the missiological perspective, we are searching. Those are the kind of challenges I can mention briefly. Yeah.
As you know, there's been a lot of talk about what it means for the church to be missionary today. I think that conversation is happening not only in the West, but a global conversation. If I asked you what is the mission of the church, how would you answer that question? What is the mission of the church, and how does it pursue that mission?
Again, the church cannot have a mission on its own, and the mission of the church is the mission of God. And for me, it brings me to the heart of the gospel, which is the incarnational gospel. Jesus coming, living among us, even though we are not receiving him, he still come down, living his privileges, and to be with us, to identify itself with us. And for me, the mission of the church today is to recover the mission expressed and demonstrated by Jesus itself is a mission of service. And he said, I come to this world not to be served, but to serve. And I come not to be the first, but to be slave. And I come to die. So that movement from going down, not seeking being the first, but being slave, servant, and dying, that should be the mission of the church today. It's not just about the proclamation in an aggressive way, you need to be saved. It's really for the church to be servant of our world in different ways. And actually looking at the heart of the gospel, things doesn't end with the death of Jesus. There is a resurrection provided by God. So it suggested that God is actually helping us to do things in his way, not in the way of the world, serving the community because he has the power to provide the resurrection to the church. And if the church is not ready to die, then the church will not experiment the miracle of the resurrection, because that is God's power. So we cannot change the world, but God is suggesting that our mission as a church is to make ourselves really available to the world, and he will bring the revival. And I think we have to rediscover that mission of service to our communities. Yeah.
I mean, one of the challenges we seem to face today also is making disciples in a global consumeristic society. How does the church go about making disciples today? What are some of the things that the church needs to rediscover to do this well?
Yeah, there is no easy answer, but I think personally, I believe that discipleship is about our entire life, and we need to rediscover the gospel as a holistic gospel, and to be there, and not just focusing on conversions and salvation. And so I think it's important and vital. It's our first calling to go out and invite people to meet Jesus and to be followers of Jesus. But we need to go beyond that. And one of the things coming out often and often in our African context is you have this massive people converted to faith. But what kind of impact they are making in their communities, in their societies? Is the salvation in Jesus leading them to make impact? And that question is raised, I believe, because our discipleship is not taking us deeper and to really live the entire life of Christ and being salt and light. And it's not an easy process. It needs really questioning ourselves as church if we are doing the right things. And I also think that in that process we need to rediscover the discipleship in the families. I think we are losing the battle of families as a place of discipleship in the churches. Maybe we are becoming too individualistic and too busy with all sorts of stuff and not giving enough space, and we tend to trade the discipleship to the church, to other organizations, and not doing it in the context of our families. And I think we need to come back and rediscover what it means to be disciple in our context and in our families.
When you see families doing discipleship well, discipling children, discipling each other, and so on, what are the kinds of things that they are doing as a family?
I think being open as a family members, because discipleship is not just about teaching. Discipleship is about living out. It's not because the parents will pass knowledge and information to the children. It's really about living out. It's like Jesus and his disciple walking together. I think even though Jesus is God, he knows everything. From a human perspective, he was also learning from the togetherness with the disciples. So I imagine our families as a place where we can be accountable to one another, we can discover, explore the gospel together, we can ask hard questions, we can grow together, and I think that is what I call discipleship. Discipleship is being together and exploring together our faith in Jesus and growing together. And my observation is more and more Christians are losing that side of discipleship. Yeah.
And you mentioned that discipleship is about a holistic development of the person. As evangelicals, we're often good at engaging people's minds. How do we go about helping people grow as disciples in their whole life?
Yeah, I think it's about the whole life, the heart, the mind, and everything. And I am in this ministry with the university students, and I always, if not at least often, challenge them not to disconnect their studies with their faith. It should be integrated. What it means for me to be a biologist and Christian. And if I'm not able to make the connection, then I'm not doing a good discipleship for myself. I need to be intentional and in building the connection between where I stand, and so that when I'm out in the marketplace, so I can really connect, engage, not as an external person who is coming there in the marketplace, but as a part of the ecosystem and being part of the community. So we need to understand the discipleship in a very holistic way, in the sense that we integrate our heart, our emotions, our mind, and make a clear connection between our faith and all areas of life we are engaged in. Yeah.
Now, you're African, and you travel all over the world, but you're living in the UK at the moment. I'm really interested in what the majority world, Christians in Africa, Asia, South America, the Middle East, First Nations and Indigenous communities, can teach the Western Church.
One of the things is how the Western Church can learn about being weak like Jesus, because even looking back in the history, it seems to me that Jesus is moving to the fragile places. From the Jewish, countries, less than 100 years, he was already going among the Gentiles, who are, during that time, the weak, the fragile, and then moving to the barbars in Europe, and now moving to places where poverty is predominant, and so on and so on. I think one of the things from my view is when a society becomes too autonomous, independent, they are giving no more place to Jesus and welcoming him. And then he go where he can be welcome. So one thing the Western Church can learn is how can we make ourselves a place of humility to welcome Jesus. It's not about material possession, it's about our heart, the disposition of our heart. Are we humble enough to suggest that, yes, here we have everything, but we still need Jesus? So that can be a lesson to learn. The second thing I will throw out is how we relate to the entire spiritual things. I think in the West, I'm living in the West, I identify myself also with the Western churches. The Enlightenment, it brought very good thing in our life, leading to such progress, and we need to celebrate the progress. I think it comes from the Lord. But at the same time, it makes us autonomous, and we become more and more blind to the spiritual realities. We don't see the engagement with the gospel no longer as a spiritual combat, as a spiritual battle. And we are losing a perspective. And maybe one thing we can learn from the global churches is, global church is considering seriously the engagement with the gospel as a spiritual combat. So we need to really learn how to pray, learn how to depend on God, learn how to depend on one another, learn humility. I think this is something maybe we can learn, and it's related to suffering, it's related to all sorts of things. And I also suggested that, and I'm glad Christians start questioning the overemphasis on material possessions. I think we need to learn again that the problem is not the material possession themselves. The problem is how they become our gods. And we need to give space for God, and maybe having a little bit a different perspective and saying these material possessions are the blessing from God, and they should not take us from God. In contrary, they should lead us to more acts of worship, and those are the kind of things. And finally, I suggested that maybe the church in the West should rethink how they read the Bible, and maybe realizing that they don't have the monopoly of a good interpretation of the Bible. And maybe they can learn that maybe other part of the world can approach the Bible in a different way, and yet God is able to speak to them. And again, it's maybe connected with the Enlightenment, who think that everything needs to be inductive, rational, and so on. And you take the text, and so if there is a proposition here, you make a deduction, and this is how we read the Bible, and we have shaped by that culture. But I believe that may not be the only way of listening to God, and we need to be open to learn and to explore together as a community if we cannot be enriched from different approaches. Very often I have the sense that we, from the Western perspective, we quickly reject other way of looking at the scripture, and we don't take even the time. And it needs time. I'm not talking about 5 minutes. It's take decades. The way we have developed actually the biblical sciences took hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's not about a 5 minutes thing. It's about giving space, allowing space of freedom and listening to learn together as a community how we can discern from God's word in different perspectives.
And it would seem to me that it's good for local churches to learn from global conversations, and global churches get fed by conversations happening at local level as well. So have you seen examples of where that's working well? Do you have any thoughts about how we might encourage those kinds of conversations, global and local conversations, to enrich each other?
I don't have right away in mind many spaces where the global conversations are taking place. From our ministry, IFES, because we intentionally emphasize our diversity, theological diversity, cultural diversity. So it's naturally create a space for the students as a way to explore and so on. And when you look back, for example, during the Lausanne Congress in 1974, the emphasis on the holistic gospel was predominantly coming from Latin America. And when you look at the people who were leading it, you have names like Samuel Escobar, René Padilla. They were involved in IFES. So even though the movement was not such huge during those days, still their connection with other people was able to shape them, to shape their theology, to rethink it. I think we need to more and more be intentional in creating such kind of space. Lausanne could be a space like that, but we need more and more spaces like that. And yet, one of the challenges the church is facing, I haven't mentioned, is actually the challenge of fragmentation. And the church is so fragmented about some little issues and who are preventing us to build a real space of dialogue and of discussion, engaging with the difficult things in order to grow together.
How do we hold that tension together of dialogue and diversity, theological and cultural, on the one hand, and the kind of inevitable slide towards conflict or fragmentation, how do we deal with that tension that seems to emerge for us all the time?
I think very often the tensions are important and we need to maintain them because we need at some point to be concerned about the integrity of the gospel. And that will lead to some tensions, and they need to be healthy tensions. But I think one of the issues is we need to find some tools to manage the tension. And one of the tools, from my perspective, a key tool is leadership. So we need to have leaders, worldwide Christian leaders, who are the kind of people who can bring us together and absorb the tensions and create a space of trust so that we can dialogue. And unfortunately, my sense is we don't have many of those kind of leaders anymore during this time. And so it's difficult to manage the tension. It's about the management of the tension because the tension is healthy. It's inevitable, but we need to pray so that God can raise more and more global leaders who can help us to sit together around the key things about the gospel. And most of us, we have a doctrinal base, at least in the evangelical community. And we can agree on some of the essential things regarding the gospel, even though we disagree on some of the things. And the agreement about the essentials would help us to have a space for dialogue. And also, for me, it's a way of discipleship because it will help me to live with my friend who is different from me, with my brother, even though he doesn't agree on the role of the woman in the leadership, we can still share something in common and actually advance the discussion on the involvement of women. So this is how I see the way forward to manage the tension, a healthy tension, in fact, yeah.
And it seems like there are some spaces that are being created for evangelicals and Protestants to gather together across the globe to discuss issues, to listen to each other. What is the role of listening to and dialoguing with other Christian traditions, Catholic, Orthodox, and so on? How does that play into all of this?
Personally, I think that the evangelical community need and have to listen to other faith. And this is where the security about our convictions comes in. And because we are not secure enough on our convictions, we are afraid to engage. And we engage in the perspective of fear. Therefore, we are very cautious in our engagement. It relates to our insecurity in our convictions. If we are holding the convictions, I always make a difference between certainties and conviction. Certainties, no problem about that, but we still have to have some convictions because they are like an anchor for the ship to maintain us stable during time of they may change, but still we need to hold those convictions and go to the engagement from a stable background. And I believe there is a place to engage with those faiths, dialoguing with them in a very positive way, contributing together. And secondly, I think in the community there are some things in the area of common good, Protestant or Roman Catholic, there are some things like what happened in Rwanda, the idea of reconciliation. For me, it is really the idea of common good. I don't expect every single person in Rwanda to become evangelical, but I see the value of reconciliation in the community. And maybe there are some spaces to engage in common good between the Christian community family worldwide without accepting the conviction the other is holding. So this is how I see the engagement.
And sometimes there's a bit of debate too about the relationship between the church and politics and secular organisations. What do you see as an ideal relationship between renewed missional churches and those secular institutions and groups?
In fact, the secular institutions per se, even though I don't like the word secular, what is a secular, what is a spiritual, I don't hold such kind of dualistic view, but I understand your perspective. Personally, I think that the word out there, I would rather use the community, is the place where we can be salt and light. And it brings me back to the whole idea of the gospel. The gospel is not just about our salvation. I'm saved. Then what next? How to live out my faith and where to live out my faith. The church is a place where I can be resources in order to go out. I see the church as a gas station for the believer to get renewed, to get energized, to get encouraged in order to drive several miles in the wilderness, sometime in the desert of the community who is not necessarily sharing the faith. But precisely I need to be there to be salt and light in the public arena, in the media, everywhere. We need to have Christians there who are well engaged. And in fact, at some point, I wonder if one of the reasons why even some Christians at certain point tend to leave the church. Because yes, they are saved, but where is the place they still have in living out their faith? So if we are encouraging them to be engaged in their community, in politics and so on, and supporting them, they will find a new excitement in their being Christians. And I have a little observation. I don't want to make conclusions, but I think that one of the reasons of the church growing in places like Africa is actually the place of lay people. In Africa, you will find very few church leaders who have been trained in a normal system, so a theological college and so on and so on. They are believers and they have to play a role. So laity become an important part of their life and they feel engaged and excited to contribute, and they rediscover that, oh, my faith is not just about my personal salvation, which is the foundation, but where do I move from that starting point, and how I grow, how I will engage with my pocket to support the ministry if I'm not part of. So the two things in some ways are interconnected from my view.
Are there practical things that those churches are doing to empower people to be disciples in society? And what are some of the things that those churches are doing?
They engage a lot in development. Many of those churches are taking part in the well-being of the community they are living in, not necessarily in a big way, but they may establish a school somewhere, a small hospital. I remember my wife, and she is a gynecologist obstetrician, and we were living in a city in West Africa. And it's difficult for the poor woman to have access to the specialists. There are very few, and it costs a lot of money. And she decided that I will offer my service as a Christian to the poor community. And it has such an impact. And both my wife and the community benefited. It became a discipleship process element, bringing excitement to my wife. And she said, oh, my Christian value can add a value to the community. So those kind of engagement are the kind of thing they are doing and helping the community and being present and offering hospitality. Hospitality is a key thing, and so those are the kind of thing they are trying to do.
And you mentioned that in places like Africa, maybe one of the keys to the growth of the church is the way in which lay people are empowered to serve women.
Yeah.
What does all this mean for the way in which we develop people for ministry, train and develop people for ministry? And by that I don't just mean professional pastors, I mean the whole church for ministry.
I think we need to revisit the way the church is becoming too professional. I think I need to pause here because I may say some challenging thing. Well, but my sense is that the Church of God tends to grow in a more chaotic setting. It seems to me that God is not concerned too much about our professionalism, but it's much concerned about our faithfulness, our heart to be, and not really to do, but to be who we are. But I can understand the pressure of our society, who is inviting us to be more and more professional. I want for us to make the difference between doing the best for God and being professional, seeking for excellence for God. And we as believers are always invited because it's an act of worship. It's coming from our heart. There is a nuance between seeking excellence and being too professional. We tend to professionalize too much the ministry. I think it's not helping the participation, the contribution. And again, looking across the line, one of the reasons why the Pentecostal churches are growing is maybe also that everyone can pray in the church. So it seems to be chaotic sometimes, but what it brings is suggesting that everyone has a freedom to participate. So we need to look beyond the chaos in the church service. I may not feel always comfortable in that setting, but the lesson that I'm picking is it allows every single member of the community to participate. And praying, standing in the church is more than what we can think of. So inviting people to participate, it may not be quite an order we want to see. It may be a little bit chaotic, but if that helps people to feel part of the kingdom, why not? By all means, if we are the people believing in heaven, if we are, as evangelicals, the people of hope, we know that the time will come where the order we are seeking will be present when Jesus will be with us around the table. So we need to have that in perspective, that eschatological perspective in our mind when we see maybe a little chaos for the time being.
Yeah. I really appreciate the time you've given us today to share something of your passion for Jesus and for mission and for the church and theology. And I hope the rest of your trip is a good one here in Sydney.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
The Global Church Project is located at www.theglobalchurchproject.com. On our website you'll find a wide range of interviews and resources for colleges, universities and churches. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.